There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. Okay, that is a quote from The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus. So if you've ever felt crushed under the weight of trying to survive in a world that just feels meaningless or unjust or overwhelmingly bleak, then Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus might resonate with you. So Camus was a French philosopher writing in the shadow of war and political turmoil and wasn't really interested in offering these easy answers, right? Instead, he explored what does it mean to live when the world seems fucking absurd, when there's no clear justice, there's no guarantee that our struggles are going to lead to success, and there's no certainty about the meaning of life itself, right? Camus begins The Myth of Sisyphus with that bold statement. There's one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. So what he's talking about is at the core of human existence is whether life is worth living at all, right? If the world is chaotic and unjust, if no higher power or cosmic justice steps in to make things right, then why keep going? So here's another quote. Whether the earth or the sun revolves around the other is a matter of profound indifference. To tell the truth, it is a futile question. On the other hand, I see many people die because they judge that life is not worth living. I see others paradoxically getting killed for the ideas or illusions that give them a reason for living, or what is called a reason for living is also an excellent reason for dying. I therefore conclude that the meaning of life is the most urgent of questions. So Camus is suggesting that suicide is often examined as a social issue, but he's more interested in the roots within individual consciousness. So he's arguing that while external factors like personal loss, right, grief, may contribute to a person's despair, the true origins of suicide lie deeper in an internal process that unfolds over time. Okay, so it's not a one-time decision, it's an internal process. So this perspective shifts the focus from societal explanations, which are still valid, but it's offering an existential one, emphasizing the role of thought and awareness in shaping a person's confrontation with life's meaning. So Camus describes suicide as something that develops within the silence of the heart. It is a slow, unconscious accumulation of despair rather than a sudden decision. He compares it to the creation of a great work of art, suggesting that it's crafted in the depths of the mind long before it manifests as an action, right? It's building before we see the decision being made. And this comparison highlights the profound solitude of this internal struggle, right? The person might not even recognize what is happening until the moment they act. So he uses an example of an apartment building manager jumping off the building, right? And the man had lost his daughter, and over time, grief had changed him. And Camus notes that this experience had undermined him, which is a very intentional word choice that conveys the slow erosion, the undermining of his inner stability. Remember, what I'm talking about is a text that was written in 1942. I am talking about a text that I think is relevant to today, but I don't agree with every facet that he's talking about. Okay, this is meant to initiate conversation. Remember that. Anyway, this part especially. Camus concludes by emphasizing that, society plays little role in the origins of such despair, right? And that's where I would switch back. But he says, instead, the worm is in man's heart. The seed of existential doubt and suffering is internal, is what he's saying. And the real struggle isn't against external circumstances, but against one's own confrontation with the absurd. So the phrase flight from light suggests that what begins as a search for meaning can lead to an escape from existence itself. So Camus is setting up his broader argument. If deep reflection can lead to despair, then the challenge is to find a way to live with the absurd rather than be destroyed by it, right? And for Camus, absurdity arises from the conflict between human beings' deep desire for meaning and order and clarity in life and the indifferent, meaningless nature of the universe. We seek answers, but the world offers none. And this tension is what Camus calls the absurd. So to explore that, Camus turns to the Greek myth of Sisyphus. So in the story, Sisyphus is condemned by the gods because he fucked up, okay? But He's condemned by the gods to roll a massive boulder up a hill, only for it to roll back down every time he reaches the top. So for eternity, he repeats this task. And on the surface, it's a perfect metaphor for despair, right? A lifetime of trying and failing, or loving and losing, right? A lifetime of never really reaching the top. It was a task that was never going to end, and no matter how hard he tried, it would always slip through his fingers. But Camus flips the script. He writes, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. Why? Because Sisyphus defies the gods not by escaping that punishment, but by choosing how to relate to it. So he accepts the absurdity of his situation and embraces the act of resistance, continuing to push the boulder despite its pointlessness. So the gods meant to break Sisyphus, to make him despair, to show him that no matter how smart or strong he was nothing before the might of the gods, right? It was a fucking humbling task. They thought that if they gave him a punishment that had no end, he would grow bitter and angry and hopeless. But instead, something else happened, something that turned the gods' plan upside down, where Sisyphus did not give in to despair. He did not let the boulder crush him physically or metaphorically, right? He didn't let the endless repetition break him. And instead, in that moment of futility, Sisyphus found something that the gods could never take from him, which was his defiance. So every time the boulder rolled back down, he would climb back up and try again. And each new attempt, something inside him started to change. He stopped thinking about reaching the top. He stopped dreaming of victory. And instead, he embraced the struggle itself. He found meaning in the very act of defying the gods, of refusing to give up, no matter how many times the boulder fell. So let's think about this in terms of like our lives and our struggles. Camus' concept of absurdity feels very relevant to the struggles that many young people are facing today, especially in the US, where youth suicide rates have been just fucking rising. The pandemic, school lockdown, social media, and the decline of religion have created an environment where a lot of teens are confronting the absurd, right? The realization that the world does not offer the stability or meaning or justice that they might have once believed or expected or been promised. But Camus describes the absurd as the moment that one recognizes that life offers no inherent meaning, and yet the human heart still longs for one. For many young people, that tension has never really been more pronounced. The pandemic forced a lot of teens into isolation during a very critical period of social and emotional development, and that was across the world, right? And instead of forming relationships and engaging with the world in meaningful ways, they were confined to screens where social media dictated their perceptions of themselves and reality. And that part is still happening, right? Platforms like Instagram and TikTok and Snapchat present this opportunity for an illusion of happiness, right? Carefully curated images of success and beauty and fulfillment. But behind these images, it's often emptiness, right? Teens are bombarded with ideals they cannot reach, reinforcing these feelings of inadequacy, right? Like, I'm not good enough, or alienation, I don't belong, and just existential anxiety. And they're chasing an illusion, much like Camus' idea of humans searching for meaning in a meaningless world. And at the same time, that decline of religion among youth removes what was historically a framework for meaning and community and coping with suffering, right? So many young people today are critically aware of the historical violence and oppression tied to organized religion, and they reject it, right? There are a lot of millennial parents that refuse to allow their children to engage with it for that reason, right? And that rejection comes with a heightened ability to think critically about imposed systems of meaning, right? Something that Camus would have admired. However, Camus would also ask, what is replacing religion? And for many of these teenagers, it's nothing except consumption. Instead of embracing the absurd and creating meaning through experience, a lot of kids are left with this void, filling it with endless scrolling and brand identities and self-commodification. So they're expected to market themselves online to sort of become products while feeling very internally detached from any real sense of self. And that normalization of school lockdowns adds another layer of the absurdity, The idea that these kids have to rehearse for mass shootings as a routine part of education, that exposes the sheer brutality of the world that they have inherited. It forces them to confront mortality and senseless violence at a very early age. Camus wrote that absurdity is most deeply felt in the confrontation between human longing and the universe's indifference, right? What could be more absurd than growing up in a world where the possibility of being shot in class is treated as inevitable? The possibility is treated as inevitable, and yet nothing changes, right? For Camus, the response to absurdity is not to escape, but to revolt, a refusal to succumb to despair, even in the face of a meaningless world. So the challenge for today's youth is finding ways to revolt in a society that offers them little but consumption and surveillance, right? Camus would argue that the answer is not in chasing this illusion of freedom and happiness and joy and whatever, but in creating meaning through lived experience, through art, through connection, through engagement with the world. But the problem remains, right? How do young people do this when the world that they inherited is actively designed to isolate, overwhelm, and exhaust them, right? And beyond that, for a poor working class person, life often feels like a Sisyphean sort of struggle, right? Working long hours for low wages, dealing with debts that never seem to go away, and facing systems of power that just seem too big to do anything about it, right? So that boulder that we push might be the fight to keep food on the table, or the endless grind of trying to get ahead in this rigged system, right? Camus doesn't deny the pain or absurdity of that. He's not saying just be happy with it. What he's saying is that we can find a kind of freedom in defiance. This idea of embracing resistance fits beautifully along Marx's call for revolutionary change, right? While Marx is focusing on structural solutions, how to overthrow systems of exploitation and build a just society from the ground up, Camus sort of zooms in on the personal, the psychological struggle. So in a world that often feels beyond hope, Camus is reminding us that rebellion in itself is an act of meaning, right? To fight for a better world, to challenge oppression even when the odds are just fucking against us, that is to refuse to let the absurdity of existence defeat us. And so Camus also helps us process the emotional toll of revolutionary struggle, right? When we fight for justice, there's no guarantee we're going to win. Oppressive systems are vast and powerful and fucking deeply entrenched, and the path forward is messy, and you can't even fucking see it half the time, right? And Camus doesn't sugarcoat that. He's acknowledging the pain, the setbacks, and the sheer exhaustion, but he's also insisting that our struggles matter, not because they'll necessarily succeed in the short term, but because they affirm our humanity. So to resist is to declare, I will not be broken by this world. So consider today's fight against economic inequality and systemic racism, or even climate destruction, right? These battles feel fucking insurmountable. And it's easy to wonder if anything that we do personally or really even like in our communities is going to make a difference on a global scale, right? And Camus offers a psychological foundation for this struggle. So he's saying that even in the face of absurdity, we can choose to act. We can choose to create our own meaning through our own defiance, to connect with others in solidarity, and to keep pushing forward even when the boulder is going to roll back down the fucking hill. We live in a moment where joy is really hard to hold on to, right? As Fisher points out in Capitalist Realism, the very idea that things can change or become better, more just, more humane, that seems impossible, right? You kind of have to let yourself be delusional to even try to imagine something beyond how we have this world set up, right? And the powers that be have convinced us that we're stuck, that this is the only system that we can all hope for or work within or make like minor adjustments to. But joy in its purest form is an act of rebellion. It is the decision to live with agency, to affirm life, even when everything around us feels constructed to keep us down, right? It's not waiting for the struggles to end before we manifest some joy or create some joy, right? It is finding the joy despite that struggle. So consider the absurdity of the U.S. political system today, right? a convicted criminal who's been impeached twice, somehow won the presidency again with the help of all his billionaire friends who have manipulated election results and are polling data to serve their own interests, right? Remember, Musk's Starlink satellites played a central role in connecting polling computers to his own network, and hours before the official tally, he claims to have known the outcome of the election, right? We are in a world where political power is bought and sold, and where the very idea of democracy is constantly undermined by the rich and powerful. So that situation is not a random quirk. That is the absurdity of our times, right? The system is so warped, so deeply corrupt, that the most ridiculous and unjust scenarios feel inevitable, right? But in this chaos, we cannot let despair take over, right? When the world feels irreparably broken, we have to remember Camus' crucial point. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, right? We continue the struggle even if it seems pointless. We resist even if we don't know if we're going to win. Just because to live is to resist right now for a lot of us, right? So this is how we find joy, not in some utopian fantasy that we're just going to wait for and pray for, but in the defiant act of living fully, even in a world that tries to deny us the right to do so. So why keep going? What's the point of all of this if it's all for nothing? The struggle itself, the fight, the act of resistance, that is where meaning lives. It's not about the destination. There is no destination. It's not about winning or losing. That doesn't exist, right? It's about how you choose to live in the face of it all. So Sisyphus, in his endless task, found joy not in succeeding, but in his refusal to give in. In his defiance, he found a kind of freedom. The gods thought that they could break him, but they couldn't. And in that, Sisyphus found his own strength. This is the key to understanding the absurdity of life, right? In this world where things are just fucking out of your control for the most part, and where powers that be seem so much bigger than us, where we're like, you guys, where's Congress? What's happening, right? It's easy to fall into despair. And that's why we're talking about this text right now. Because just like Sisyphus, we might feel like we are pushing boulders up a hill that is just inevitably going to roll back down. That's what this past 8 years feels like, right? So we might look at the world, at least in the US, I should say. But we might look at the world, especially at the mess of like politics and corruption and injustice, and just be like, what the fuck is the point? Like, this is fucking absurd. And it is. But this struggle, this defiance against the absurdity, that is where we find our meaning. There's always going to be boulders. There's always going to be struggles. The world is never going to be perfect. And that's not what we're fighting for. The systems of power will always try to keep us down. But like Sisyphus, we have to keep pushing. We have to keep fighting. We have to keep imagining. And in that fight, we find joy. And it's not the kind of joy that the world tries to sell you, not the kind that comes in a shiny package or is bought and delivered within 24 hours. It's the joy of living authentically, of standing up and saying, I'm not going to fucking do this anymore. So yeah, there's going to be times where we feel small, where the weight of the world just feels too heavy. And when the boulders seem too big and the hill just looks too steep and you don't want to fucking go up there again. But you have the power to resist, right? The world is absurd, but in that absurdity is our freedom somewhere in there. This is the lesson of Camus, and it's also the lesson of capitalist realism, which is in the face of absurdity, we are not powerless. The system is not inevitable. And in our joy, in our defiance, in our refusal to accept the world as it is, we find our freedom. So to struggle is to live, and to live is to resist. And together, these ideas create a powerful framework for understanding both the material and existential stakes of revolution. So they're challenging us not to just imagine a better world, but to embrace the fight for it as an act of hope and meaning in an absurd and unjust world, right? And that's where I want to leave us today. Thanks so much for listening. Bye for now.